Neil Diamond's Beautiful Noise album, released 50 years ago this year in 1976, is a rather interesting artefact given that he'd never recorded an album prior and never recorded one since, at least in my mind, that is such a consistent level. It's a very short peak, a burst of inspiration, a great collection of songs, and although there were many more special songs individually to come after 1976, Beautiful Noise as an album cannot be beaten for me. So, on this what is a lovely afternoon outside, a lovely sunny afternoon, why don't you join me celebrating this wonderful album today? And for this show, I'm your host, Toby Jones. Did you like that? There was no AI involved in writing that introduction, that was all me, and welcome along to a celebration on its 50th anniversary of the Beautiful Noise album. This is an album that I have featured on the channel previously, but I wanted to look back at it again 5 or 6 years later to when I did my first review, and why this still remains, after such a long time of hearing it, still remains my favourite Neil Diamond album. Now, I'm not going to go through all of Neil Diamond's history here. I'm going to go through the direct history from a couple of years before this came out to the build-up of what ended up being Beautiful Noise in 1976. And then we're going to talk about the album directly and what's so good about these songs and the album overall, as to why I think it's better than any other album that Neil Diamond has released. So first off, we have to go back to 1973 and Neil Diamond's soundtrack album called Jonathan Livingston Seagull. Now, this was a complete departure to what had come before. This is pretty well an instrumental soundtrack with a couple of songs with vocal. You've got Bee and Lonely Looking Sky are the two ones that's probably known the most from this. And I think even though the film was a disaster, the soundtrack was very well received, and I think from a musical, compositional point of view, it's great. And there were some hurdles definitely, but without those hurdles, Neil Diamond could have possibly got an Oscar and some very significant awards for this work. As it happened, that didn't happen. But I think that Jonathan Livingston Seagull, it's an album that I've grown into over a little bit of time. Since a long time ago, I've always liked the track B. But what I really like about this album, briefly, there is a sequence which I think is called The Odyssey, which is, The Odyssey, which is B, Lonely Looking Sky, and Dear Father as a compilation, if you like, of those three songs. And that's really nice on this album, Jonathan Livingston Seagull. But that was quite a departure to what had come before. And the album that comes directly before this is an album called Serenade. Now, if I'd have put my albums all in order, then I would have been able to reach for that first, but such is the case, I couldn't. So this was released from 1974, and this has only got 8 tracks on it, a strong collection of 8 tracks, particularly I've Been This Way Before, Lady Magdalene, Longfellow Serenade, but this one doesn't quite hold together as a full album the way that Beautiful Noise does. The same can be said of albums before Jonathan Livingston Seagull, the likes of Moods and Stones. There's some very good songs in there, but it is very much light and shade when you consider the good songs on those albums. You could look at this album as more of a concept. Brother Love's Travelling Salvation Show. And you could argue that that maybe holds together better as a theme, as a concept of albums that came after it. And the artwork's a big part of that. I'll talk about that in a little bit. But I still think this is a little bit primitive, and Neil Diamond's still a little bit unsure of his peak self to rival Beautiful Noise. You could talk about Taproot Manuscript as having that little bit of a concept as well, particularly on the second side of the album with the African songs. But personally, I'm not so interested in that, so that doesn't go to my taste as such. Serenade, compared to albums that have possibly come before, goes about its business a little bit slower, so that does have a bit of a different quality to it. I think about the likes of Yes I Will, Lady Magdalene, which is a long song I talked about briefly, but unfortunately that album does include the song Reggae Strut. So, after Serenade, Neil Diamond had the album come out called Beautiful Noise. And again, I have gone to the depths, as many long-term viewers of the channel will know, of my Neil Diamond books. I have combined the Laura Jackson biography and the David Wilde biographies, both of which I've mentioned before are really well worth a read if you are Neil Diamond fans, to plug a little bit of context towards this. So in the Laura Jackson book, I've lifted that this is a combination between Neil Diamond and Robbie Robertson, considerably here, which doesn't happen very often at all, the producer's name is quite clearly explicitly on the front cover. Neil Diamond's Beautiful Noise, produced by Robbie Robertson. And these two got together. They were almost near neighbours, really, at one point. They got together and came up with the idea of a concept album around the Tin Pan Alley experience. And Robbie Robertson had very high praise for Neil Diamond. The idea wasn't necessarily reciprocated because Neil Diamond hadn't heard a lot of the band's work, which is the group that Robbie Robertson was part of. But Robbie Robertson had really high praise for Neil Diamond for a lot of him. He said that he felt that Neil Diamond filled the musical vacuum between Elvis Presley and Frank Sinatra, which at that point particularly is high praise indeed. And David Wilde extends Robbie Robertson's quote to say that people had to have something, and as such, they adopted Neil Diamond. And they toyed briefly with calling this album Street Life, which I think actually would have maybe enhanced the experience, played into the vibe a little bit more of this Beautiful Noise. But as such, they reverted back to the belief that the track inspired by Neil Diamond's daughter Marjorie, Beautiful Noise, after saying, "What a beautiful noise," and Neil thought Beautiful Noise, I like the sound of that, his daughter very much pushing him to use the title of Beautiful Noise for a song, and as such, the album was born, called Beautiful Noise, from 1976. Well, the first thing I'm going to focus on here is the artwork, and for that we're going to use the LP because that is the king of artwork. I've talked about how I prefer the CD format, but for a video like this, the vinyl LP really does it. Now on this album, this is something that does something that no other Neil Diamond before, or at least, or after, I don't think, really does. Maybe the jazz singer does it possibly, but the artwork is really striking for this studio album. The city of New York is front and centre. There's the contrast in the colours, the vibrancy, the distinctive font on the front cover, which makes this album feel its own. Of course, that achieves nothing without having good music. If it's just a nice, pretty looking album cover and the music's trash, then it's no good. But the blend of the brilliant music on this and the lovely album art really ticks all the boxes. That is done more justice by the cracking gatefold of Neil Diamond in the middle of this picture. You can see him just there below the WS Conley or Connolly sign with the with pool and snooker, which you can probably see if you're watching the video, but you won't be able to see if you're watching on Spotify. I wonder whether this would have been more effective as a front cover. I don't think so. But it's a really nice addition. Again, a gatefold sleeve, a lovely picture of the whole New York vibe, and that really plays into things. Looking at other albums where the artwork plays into it, or possibly not, Neil Diamond himself is front and centre on Hot August Night. It gives this album a real magical vibe. The back cover as well of Neil's performance. I appreciate that's something that's quite a lot easier to get on a live album than a studio album, but that's not there so much on his next live album, Love at the Greek. He's kind of there, but almost in the background, really, of the image. It's not as much there. Maybe this back cover could have been used, but is that as captivating as Hot August Night? No, I don't think so. You could even say that on previous live albums that Neil is front and centre. Gold, for example, that's a nice album cover. But I don't think his stagecraft was quite as developed then. But I don't want to explore the live album thing all too much because I want to touch on that when I examine Hot August Night in a separate video. And I've talked a little bit again about the concept of Brother Love's Travelling Salvation Show. That's an album that's got Neil Diamond front and centre. That's another album that has got a really nice gatefold sleeve. But the other albums, apart from Brother Love to this point, don't necessarily add as much to the image as Beautiful Noise does. So that's the one thing that I think Beautiful Noise does very well. Looking at this as an overall album, we all know that Neil Diamond, and being a big Neil Diamond fan, I can absolutely say this, that Neil Diamond, before and after this, is very capable of writing excellent individual tracks. I'm going to pick some of the lesser talked about tracks on previous albums. Cold Water Morning from Taproot Manuscript, Morningside from Moods, and The Singer Sings His Song from Touching You, Touching Me. Of course, I could have picked many others. But none of the albums that come before Beautiful Noise, possibly apart from Just For You, really, are pound for pound as good as the songs, for me at least. You're more than entitled to disagree, on Beautiful Noise. I always dismiss Just For You a little bit of as an album because Solitary Man and Cherry Cherry are both on the debut album. So although that album is brilliant, a collection of his bang records, it doesn't feel as much of an intended album, if you like, in terms of the art form of the album than Beautiful Noise is. So discarding Just For You, there's nothing else that really has that extraction. This is the peak of extracting the most from Neil Diamond's songwriting abilities. Linked to that, there aren't any duds on here, I don't think. Almost feels like a bit of a low blow, this, but on Velvet Gloves and Spit, you've got the Pot Smokers song. On Moods, you've got possibly Porcupine Pie, even Gitchy Gumi, which have decent entertainment value. On Serenade, we have Reggae Strut. I'm not going to go after this album because there are some quite painful points. The question I guess you could ask, though, and counter that with is a brilliant but flawed piece of work better than a more consistent piece of work? Has something that's got higher highs but maybe doesn't float all there all the time? Is maybe something that is there constantly? And for those of you listening rather than watching, I guess is 80% throughout better than 100% for one track, then down to 60, and that gets you an average of 80. Yeah, that's logical in my mind. Again, this is the art form for me, the whole art form of the album overall. Not necessarily an examination of individual tracks against others. It's more of a feel thing that this album has. The album artwork, the tracks itself, and I think this shows a very small space in time. I alluded to that in the introduction. This was a space in time where it was a very short peak. It was a burst of inspiration, a great collection of songs. But what's maybe an easy target with this is because I think Neil's output went downhill after this. We had I'm Glad You're Here With Me Tonight and You Don't Bring Me Flowers, and then September Morn. Obviously after that we had the brilliant Jazz Singer with at least a couple of songs. But I suppose it's an easy target because this is literally the peak, pretty much factually the peak, if you like it, when you compare it to albums afterwards, a couple of albums afterwards. Beforehand you can always have that debate, but I'd be very surprised if anybody does. Great. If anybody considers I'm Glad You're Here With Me Tonight Neil Diamond's best work, then power to you. Good stuff. But I certainly don't. I think the popular consensus would be that isn't the case. Therefore, if there's a considered drop-off after this, then you can say, yeah, that's the peak because things drop off after this, right? So maybe it's a bit of that AC/DC Back in Black thing, the pressure to follow up, that you have such a brilliant album that anything that comes after is going to be a disappointment. I think when it comes to I'm Glad You're Here With Me Tonight, an album that I haven't listened to for a little while, and again, opinions can change, of course they can, as time goes on. It's certainly an album that really pales in comparison to Beautiful Noise. And then the final thing, before we look at the tracks themselves, the production values here. Is this all Robbie Robertson's doing? Does Robbie Robertson really deserve that almost second title billing, if you look at it as a film poster, on this album artwork? It's difficult to know. It's difficult to say. But what I can say is that this album is somewhat different because it can be considered, at points, easy listening, adult contemporary, but it's exactly at that appropriate level where it's not soppy or eye-rolling enough to be considered corny or over the top, and I think that's something that later in Neil's career, that's something he could be considered guilty of. But when you look at elements of this album maybe that Robbie Robertson brings to the production and possibly enhances is the strings. That's something in particular that when I've revisited an album is an element to me that really stand out. When I talk about the individual tracks, I'll be talking about a range of instruments and how they really fit in. Were they in Neil Diamond's work before? I certainly haven't noticed as much as they are on Beautiful Noise. Maybe I've missed them. Maybe that's something else that I've brought to the party today. I think I've got to be careful with this as well, that this is a celebration of this album, so I'm not going to say much that's negative about it, but you can blow the trumpet, to be a bit of a pun, if you like, about this, that you can blow the trumpet and say it's probably better than it is. Possibly. That's something I might do. But the strings in particular is something that I really hear when listening to this album and when revisiting this day in preparation for this video. And after this, Neil had certain ability to carry on with great songs. You Don't Bring Me Flowers, That Kind from September Morn, the great songs from the Jazz Singer. But they weren't constant, like the songs from this album. The last thing I'll say before we get into the individual songs is the cracking sleeve. Again, another picture of Neil on the vinyl, and just really enhancing the story, the concept of all this. This album is a series of recollections seen through the eyes of a young songwriter making his way through the streets of New York City's Tin Pan Alley in the early 1960s. It is made up of people, places and events from a period which some have called a renaissance of the American spirit. Others The beginnings of a new age of decadence. This is all very fancy. Whatever history calls it, the early 60s opened the door to a new wave of consciousness for most of those who passed through its beautiful but noisy portals. ND. Here we go then, let's look at the individual songs on Beautiful Noise. I'm going to make one gripe about this album, and that is the fact that, as so many albums did at this point, I don't know why, if anybody can leave a commercial issue why this was done below, I'd be greatly appreciative. The songs aren't in order on the back cover. So to give you the proper order of these songs, the album starts with Beautiful Noise, we then go to Stargazer, Lady O, Don't Think Feel, Surviving the Life, If You Know What I Mean, brilliantly closes out side 1. Side 2 opens with Street Life, then Home Is a Wounded Heart, Jungle Time, Signs, and closing out the album, Dry Your Eyes. So let's start things off with the brilliant title track, Beautiful Noise. There's a Moog synthesizer on this, which adds an element of difference to this track to possibly anything that Neil's done before. This is quite literally a beautiful noise. It does what it says on the tin. The instrumentation sounds great. It provides a gentle, joyful song, which really matches the lyrics. Stargazer, the second song, which I can report on now in 2026. If there's one thing I can add to this album that I haven't discussed before, it's that this song features briefly in the new Ryan Gosling film, Project Hail Mary, which I saw at the cinema last week. And sitting there, I thought, I know this. There's only about 20 seconds of the track, and then it goes away. But that was probably my favourite highlight of the film. Fantastic. Neil Diamond in films. Let's have more of that. But the song overall, it's another joyful sounding song. It goes along at a really nice pace, and I think that it's quite sing-along in terms of its lyrics. The instrumental section with the trumpet, the clarinet and the strings as well is a real joy. And I think without those instruments in this song, I think that this could potentially fall out, not be as good as what it is. Therefore, I think they are the highlight of this song, particularly the trumpet as well in this song. Lady O is a brilliant example of a saxophone solo as well. Gloriously lush song in its arrangement and sound. Neil's soft vocal, my favourite of the record. I distinctly remember when I heard this album, maybe for the first time, but quite early when I listened to it. This wasn't one of my first Neil Diamond albums. This was once I'd got the vinyl, I guess 6-7 years ago now. And I'll never forget this. It's great when you have a connection to certain songs. That I'd gone away to a university for a couple of days. I didn't necessarily go away to university, but I had a couple of days where I'd go for a course, for an intense course, if you like, for a couple of days, and stop over in a hotel. I did distinctly remember that night, even though it was 6 odd years ago now, sitting in that hotel, listening to Lady O, and that's where that song places me every time I hear it. Isn't it marvellous how music can do that? Another idea for a video, which I did write down earlier today. So even when I'm recording, I give away what's potentially to come next. But the second half of this song in particular has the introduction of the saxophone. There's a tenor sax solo from Tom Scott, according to the liner notes. And those of you who have watched the channel before will know that I love a saxophone solo, and this one is certainly no different. Don't Think Feel is the fourth song on this album, and it's the first very different. It is at least different stylistically, which on another Neil Diamond record could be considered a stinker. I think the difference here is that it fits into the overall vibe, the joyful concept from the first 2 tracks. Don't overthink things too much, just feel them. And the whole Beautiful Noise concept, in my mind, is showcased here. We've got a flute solo here. Have we seen this from Neil previously? Maybe we have, but to my recollection, nothing's coming quickly. There's a really great arrangement of instruments being used well, and the songs glued together by a theme, but they're different enough, both lyrically and musically, to not become monotonous, which is what some of his 80s work did, that everything kind of all sounds the same. These are similar to an extent, the lyrical themes possibly, some of the musical elements, but they're different enough to not become all the same. Surviving the Life is probably the most joyful song on this record yet, and possibly overall. A song that, for me, really makes you want to get up and move. It moves along at a brisk pace. Neil's soothing vocal blended into the music, the chorus, the gospel almost like chorus. Again, joyful, positive feel. The line, "You're alive, you might as well be glad." A line that gets me every time, and even when I'm down in the dumps, that makes me think a little bit more positively every time I hear it. It almost makes me reframe my thoughts that little bit. It's a very blunt statement, isn't it? You're alive, you might as well be glad about it. But when it's sung in that joyful way, it does make me reframe my thoughts, possibly. There's a great, I think it's a Hammond organ or a piano solo in this as well. And this is another song that I don't think works as well without the background choir playing off Neil's vocal. Again, like Stargazers Don't Think Feel, uses the instruments, the voices to enhance it. Is that what Robbie Robertson is bringing to the table here? Possibly, but I can't say for sure. Side 1 ends with If You Know What I Mean. Very much a striking turn back down to earth, and creates that light and shade feel on the album. The shade that we had more, at least musically, with the sounds of Lady-O. Again, something you feel on the cover, which I'll just show the CD, that you've got it on the front cover with the gradients between the different songs, but even on the back cover where you've got all the different songs, there's that gradient between a darker bluey colour, a red, kind of orangey yellow, and then that flamey sort of orange colour. When I was doing GCSE English, I never thought that the curtain's blue, that means it's melancholy. I never got into that, but for some reason, it's something I'm getting into lately. So if I'm waxing lyrical about that too much, then shoot me down in the comments. This is a song that builds beautifully. Really does, to the main chorus. The chorus is brilliant, and I still do not know how Neil holds his voice, because I can't, and the radio played like a carnival tune as we lay in our bed in the other room, when we gave it away for the sake of a dream in a penny arcade. Yeah, I definitely struggle with that one. And particularly the final chorus, Neil's voice building in the final chorus, the instruments playing along with it, is just glorious. This is one of my favourite Neil Diamond tracks. We then go to side 2 with Street Life. A very inviting opening, very sort of groovy, enjoyable opening. And I think this is the most explicit Tin Pan Alley New York song on this yet. Maybe Jungle Time, which to come, is more explicit. But again, the strings really here, combining with the other instruments, the up-tempo feel to this is probably the highlight of this track, the strings being the highlights of Street Life. Home is a Wounded Heart is another highlight of this record for me, another terrific song. I do like the upbeat songs on this, but I think I prefer the more melancholy or slower tracks when I'm to examine this as individual tracks. It's a great body of work overall, but looking at the individual tracks as well, I do prefer the slower, more melancholic sounding songs. Just a personal taste thing, really. And this is a top deep cut, although it was the B-side to the single, the title track Beautiful Noise. Neil's vocal is brilliant here, and looking at the lyrics, it's not as developed lyrically as some other tracks on this album, but the emotional feel, the emotion in Neil's voice, particularly the last verse, is a pleasure to listen to. And as a side note, the live version from this album, or box set, Neil Diamond Stages Performances 1970 to 2002, one of the only tracks on this record that is from this time. In fact, I don't think there's anything else on this album that features on this set, which is disappointing. But a very good rendition of this on the Stages box set. And that actually is a praise that I wouldn't necessarily give to some of these other tracks on this album live. That's maybe one of the only things I'd say negatively. But I think that's more of a love at the Greek thing than a song thing and how they're performed. It's just that this is so good, isn't it, Hot August Night, that the songs from previous albums are enhanced, pretty much all enhanced by their live versions on Hot August Night. We then get to Jungle Time, track number 9, which is a really groovy opening. It's like Surviving the Life that makes you want to move, but in a more sort of jazzy, groovy way. And another song that could be considered a dud if it was placed elsewhere on another album. Particularly styled differently, if it sounds a little bit different, then it could be in the band of Reggae Strut. But again, it works here thematically. I think it does. I might be biased, but I certainly think it does. And then we have Signs, the 10th track, and that's Signs, not Saints. F1 fans might get that one, but I'll brush over it pretty quickly. This one is somewhat dreamy. Again, lush. It almost puts me in a bit of a trance, the whole Sail Away, Sail Along section. Gentle and beautiful. There's a possible flute in there, I think. It's not mentioned on the liner notes, but that might be what the instrument is in there. That's a really great addition to this song. One of my favourites again on the record. And then the album ends with Dry Your Eyes, which is a great close to the album. Neil's vocal again, great. It's slow, gentle, reflective, and nostalgic, almost the end of an innocence, and again, brings the story to a close. So this is a collection of all great songs. In summary, I think this is the only time that I feel that Neil has achieved that with an album. The conceptual angle that brings it all together, plus the sound created, possibly with the assistance of Robbie Robertson's production. How much Neil was involved, I certainly don't know with that element. But I'm going to bring one final caveat into this, is that had the You Don't Bring Me Flowers album been recorded and released as a double album as intended, named the American Popular Song, that would have been more of a concept before the company released a single album to capitalise on the title track. Could that have rivaled Beautiful Noise from an artistic standpoint? We'll never know, because we'll have to live in an alternative universe to get there. But Beautiful Noise, I imagine for anybody who's stayed this long has listened to it before, but if you are somebody that has listened to this and maybe don't have such a positive angle on this album, or do have a positive angle, go and get it out, whether you've got the CD, whether you've got the vinyl, maybe even the cassette. I did see the cassette in a charity shop not that long ago, and I was half tempted to pick it up, but I thought, no, you've already got the CD, you've already got the vinyl, we don't need more in this room of stuff, but might have been a nice artifact to get. Or whether you're just streaming it on Spotify, then go and listen to it. And if you're not convinced with the whole album idea, well, the standout songs, I think, from this, If You Know What I Mean, is probably the best. It's one of my favourite Neil songs. Lady-O, the title track's good if you want something that's a little bit more joyful, but maybe as a more morose, end-of-the-night song, if you like. Possibly plump for Dry Your Eyes. I hope you've enjoyed this celebration of Neil Diamond's music, the 1976 album Beautiful Noise. The disclaimer for this, the thing I'd say is that I've talked about some of his other albums. I haven't bashed them, but I've said, well, why Beautiful Noise is better than those. And that, of course, helps the story out. But that's not to mean that any of those albums are bad. Alright, there are one or two weaker albums, let's just say. But it's not to say that any of those albums are bad. Just that I prefer Beautiful Noise over them, and a celebration of Beautiful Noise, and that's something that I'm hoping to be doing in the weeks leading up to Neil Diamond's new release, Wild at Heart. If you've enjoyed this celebration of Beautiful Noise, then please do consider leaving a like, commenting your thoughts down below, subscribing for regular Neil Diamond content. There's a lot of Neil Diamond content already on the channel. I do cover other artists well in a range of different genres, so feel free to go onto the channel page and look at all that. But YouTube's algorithm really is helped by engagement. You guys liking, commenting. My last Neil Diamond video on Wild at Heart did very, very well, and that was thanks to all you liking, commenting down below, saying how excited you were for the new release. So I really appreciate your support, and if you can do that again here, that would be absolutely fantastic. We're also available as a podcast form. If you're watching this on YouTube and some future videos you might not be able to watch, then you can listen to them as an audio or a video podcast form on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and I think as an audio podcast form wherever else you get your podcasts. I also put social media posts out whenever a new video is going out on Facebook, Instagram and X. So if you don't see my videos directly on YouTube, it might be a good idea for you to follow me over on those pages if you have them, so that you can be informed of any future content. And I also have a TikTok page, which I post to occasionally, which generally is shorter, more concise clips about the element of a longer show like this possibly, but I only do those really occasionally. But thank you for your company. There may well be another video there that you would like to go and watch next. Whether you do or whether you don't, thank you for joining me with this celebration of 1976's Beautiful Noise, an album which at 50 years old this year remains my favourite Neil Diamond studio record. Thank you for watching.